She deserves better, don't you think? Nick's voice sliced through the quiet hum of the kitchen. I paused mid-step, hidden behind the corner, clutching the edge of the wall. Rayon chuckled dismissively, his voice low and uninterested. Stop being dramatic, Nick. She's fine. We're fine. Fine. That word lingered in the air like stale perfume. I peeked into the room, my breath hitching, as I saw Nick leaning casually against the counter, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in that familiar, teasing way of his. His expression suggested he was moments away from delivering another of his sarcastic barbs. You know, Nick continued, his tone light but cutting, if I were her, I'd expect more. A little attention wouldn't hurt, big brother. Rayon barely glanced up from his laptop, his fingers dancing over the keys. Noted. Thanks for the unsolicited advice. My heart thudded uncomfortably against my ribs. There was no malice in Nick's words, no outright insult, but the implication burned all the same. Did he really think I deserved more? Did I think I deserved more? Stepping into the room felt like breaking through a film of tension. What's this serious discussion about me? I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone. My voice startled them both. Nick's grin widened instantly, while Rayon barely looked up. Nothing too scandalous, Nick replied smoothly. Just pointing out how lucky Rayon is to have you. Uh-huh, I said, tilting my head and narrowing my eyes at him, trying to appear amused rather than flustered. And here I thought you only reserved your charm for your photo shoots. Nick leaned forward slightly, his smirk softening. I'm an equal opportunity charmer, Joe. You know that. Something about the way he said my name sent a flicker of warmth up my spine, and I hated myself for noticing. Meanwhile, Rayon muttered something incomprehensible under his breath and returned his attention to the glowing screen in front of him. He hadn't even registered the tension in the room. Or maybe he had, and he simply chose to ignore it. Anyway, Nick said, clapping his hands together, I'll leave you two lovebirds alone. I have a shoot to prep for. He turned to me, his expression once again veiled in that maddeningly casual way. Don't work too hard, Joe. As he left, I couldn't help but feel like his words hung in the air longer than they should have. The silence that followed was unbearable. I sat across from Rayon, watching him type furiously, his brow furrowed in concentration. Busy day? I asked, hating the way my voice sounded so small. Always, he replied without looking up. Deadlines, you know how it is. Sure, I murmured. But I didn't know. Not really. It had been years since Rayon had let me into that part of his world. Now I was just an observer in his life, a background fixture he occasionally noticed, but never truly saw. My mind drifted back to Nick's comment. Was he just teasing, or was there a hint of truth in his words? The idea clung to me like an unwelcome guest, refusing to leave even as I busied myself with mundane tasks around the house. By the time evening rolled around, I was still replaying the scene in my head, dissecting every word, every glance. Rayon, meanwhile, had fallen asleep on the couch, his laptop still open on his chest. I stood over him for a moment, taking in the lines of his face, the slight furrow of his brow, even in sleep. He looked peaceful, but distant, like someone I once knew, now wrapped in a cocoon of his own making. And then there was Nick. His presence lingered in the room like the scent of cologne. I could hear his voice in my head, his words wrapping around me in a way that felt both comforting and dangerous. That night, as I lay in bed beside Rayon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. A tiny crack had formed in the walls we had built around our lives. And even though I didn't know what lay beyond it, I found myself inching closer, drawn to the possibility of something different. The email came late one evening, as I was organizing a cluttered drawer in the kitchen. Nick's name popped up on my screen, casual and friendly. Joe, need a favor. Let me know if you're free next week. Something for the house remodel. Nick. When I mentioned it to Rayon later that night, he barely looked up from his laptop. Sure, he said. his voice detached. Nick's good with that creative stuff. Go for it. That was all the encouragement I needed. Or maybe it was just permission to satisfy my curiosity. A harmless meeting, after all. The studio was everything I expected, industrial, with sprawling windows that let in sharp streaks of light, giving the whole space a moody, cinematic quality. Canvases leaned haphazardly against the walls, and the air carried the faint tang of coffee and paint. Perfect timing, Nick called from across the room. He was adjusting the position of a towering light stand, his movements fluid and self-assured. He looked up, flashing me a grin that was equal parts welcoming and mischievous. Thought you might bail? Why would I? I replied, hanging my coat on the back of a nearby chair. Nick walked toward me, a camera slung around his neck. Because I know how much you love being in front of a camera, he teased. Relax, Joe. It's just some reference shots for the lighting. Nothing crazy. I hesitated, glancing around the room. Lighting for what, exactly? For the remodel, of course, he said with mock seriousness. How else am I supposed to figure out how the light hits the space without you in it? That makes zero sense, Nick, I said, laughing despite myself. His ability to disarm me with a single quip was infuriating and effective. Humor me, he said, gesturing to a stool in the center of the room. It'll be quick, I promise. Sitting under the hot glare of the studio lights, I felt uncomfortably exposed. Nick adjusted the angle of the camera, his eyes narrowing in concentration. Look this way, he said, his tone softer now, almost coaxing. His gaze lingered on me, but it didn't feel invasive. It felt attentive. Nick, I said, shifting in my seat, you're taking this way too seriously. I take art seriously, Joe, he replied, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. You're the one making it awkward. I rolled my eyes, but something in his tone unsettled me. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Click, click, click. The sound of the shutter filled the room, each snap sending a strange thrill through me. I told myself it was the novelty of the situation, the unfamiliarity of being in front of the lens. But when Nick lowered the camera and studied the screen with a faint, approving nod, I felt my heart quicken for reasons I didn't want to admit. Come here, he said, waving me over to the monitor. You have to see these. I stood next to him, the proximity almost startling. He smelled faintly of cedarwood and something sharper, cleaner. The images on the screen were striking. He'd captured me in a way I'd never seen before. Soft shadows, subtle highlights, an expression I didn't even recognize as my own. You're good at this, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. No, he corrected, his tone serious for once. You're good at this. You just don't know it. The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. Nick turned toward me then, his hand brushing mine as he reached to adjust the screen. The contact was fleeting, but it lingered, an unspoken question hanging in the air between us. I should have stepped back. I should have laughed it off. But instead, I froze, my breath catching as he looked at me with an intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. Nick? I started. But before I could finish, his lips brushed mine, light, tentative, almost as if he was testing the waters. I didn't pull away. Not immediately. For a fraction of a second, I let myself fall into the moment, the warmth of his touch erasing the boundaries I'd carefully constructed in my mind. And then reality came crashing back. I stepped back abruptly, the stool behind me nearly toppling over. The words caught in my throat, and I shook my head, grabbing my coat and bolting for the door. The air outside was sharp and biting, a stark contrast to the heat that still simmered under my skin. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over, each detail more vivid than the last. It wasn't supposed to happen. It didn't mean anything. And yet, as I walked away from the studio, I couldn't stop the feeling that I'd crossed a line I wouldn't be able to uncross. I couldn't escape my own thoughts. The kiss replayed in my mind endlessly, like a record stuck on a single haunting note. Every detail felt burned into my memory. Nick's gaze, the subtle warmth of his breath, the unexpected softness of the moment. And yet, what troubled me most wasn't the kiss itself. It was what it represented. The undeniable truth that something had been missing from my life for far too long. Sitting at the dining table that morning, I watched Rayon, his face illuminated by the pale glow of his laptop screen. He was oblivious to the storm churning inside me. I reached for my coffee, more to give my hands something to do than out of any real need for caffeine. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Yeah, fine," he replied without looking up, his fingers tapping away at the keys. "Busy day ahead. You?" I hesitated. "Not much planned. I might go for a walk later. Clear my head." "Sounds good," he murmured, already lost in whatever project had claimed his attention. I wanted to scream, or cry, or maybe both. Instead, I nodded to myself and stood, retreating to the kitchen to avoid the suffocating silence. Over the next few days, I tried harder with Rayon. I really did. I cooked his favorite meals, arranged our schedules so we could share an evening together, even suggested we go for a drive, something we used to do all the time when we first started dating. But no matter what I did, it felt like I was speaking a language he no longer understood. One night, as we sat together on the couch, I leaned my head against his shoulder, hoping for even the smallest sign of connection. He shifted slightly, his arm draping loosely around me, but his focus remained on his phone. "Rayon," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like we're drifting apart?" He frowned, finally setting the phone down. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I lied. "Maybe I'm just overthinking." "You're probably just stressed," he said, his tone pragmatic. "Things will settle down. They always do." And that was it. No deeper conversation, no probing questions. Just a vague reassurance that felt more like dismissal than comfort. Nick, on the other hand, was anything but dismissive. The next time I saw him, it was at a casual family gathering, an occasion I'd been dreading for days. He greeted me with his usual charm, his tone light and teasing, as if nothing had happened between us. But there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of amusement, or perhaps something more. "Joe?" he said when we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. "You look different today? Lighter, maybe?" I stiffened, unsure how to respond. "Must be the new moisturizer," I quipped, trying to match his easy demeanor. He chuckled, leaning against the counter in that effortless way of his. "Whatever it is, it suits you." The words were innocent enough, but the way he said them wasn't. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks and turned away, busying myself with arranging a tray of appetizers. "You've been avoiding me," Nick said after a beat, his voice quieter now. "I haven't," I lied, still not meeting his gaze. "Joe," he said again, and this time there was no teasing in his tone. "It wasn't a big deal. You don't have to make it one." I finally looked at him then, searching his face for some sign of what he really wanted from me. But Nick was as unreadable as ever, his expression calm, his posture relaxed, as if the kiss had been nothing more than a passing moment. "Maybe it wasn't for you," I said, surprising even myself with the honesty of my words. For a fleeting moment, his mask slipped. There was something in his eyes, regret, curiosity, desire. I couldn't tell, and before I could dissect it further, the sound of footsteps approaching snapped us both back to reality. Over the next few days, I found myself hyper-aware of Nick's presence. At family dinners, he caught my eye more often than seemed accidental. His comments, always veiled in humor, felt charged in a way I wasn't sure anyone else noticed. And every time our paths crossed, I felt the same rush of emotions: guilt, curiosity, and something dangerously close to excitement. At night, As I lay beside Rayan, I found myself wondering what it would be like to turn back the clock, to erase the kiss, the tension, the way Nick's voice lingered in my mind long after he was gone. But another part of me, a part I barely recognized, didn't want to go back. It wanted to see what would happen next. The house buzzed with the familiar hum of family chatter. Plates clinked in the dining room, the faint aroma of rosemary and garlic wafting through the air. Rayan was deep in conversation with his father about some structural design, an ongoing project they both seemed equally obsessed with. I sat quietly on the edge of the living room sofa, nursing a half-empty glass of wine. The soft fabric beneath my fingertips did little to soothe the tension that had taken up permanent residence in my shoulders. Nick appeared in the doorway, a subtle grin pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You look exhausted," he said, his voice low enough to keep our exchange private. I offered a weak smile. "It's been a long week." "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the hallway. "I'll fix that." I hesitated, glancing toward the dining room where Rayan was laughing at something his father had said. "Nick." "Joe, it's just a massage," he interrupted, his tone light but insistent. "You'll thank me later." The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting warm shadows across the walls. Nick pulled a chair into the center of the room, gesturing for me to sit. I perched on the edge, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. "Relax," he said, stepping behind me. His hands rested lightly on my shoulders for a brief moment before he began to knead the tight muscles at the base of my neck. I let out an involuntary sigh as the tension began to melt away. His touch was firm but gentle, each movement precise and deliberate. "You're good at this," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "Years of practice," he replied. "You wouldn't believe how many models complain about back pain during shoots." The mention of his work should have grounded me, reminded me of the boundaries I was so close to crossing, but instead, it only heightened the intimacy of the moment. His fingers trailed down to my shoulders, pausing briefly as if testing my reaction before continuing. "Nick," I began, my voice faltering. "This is probably—" "Just let me help you," he said, cutting me off gently. "You're always taking care of everyone else. Let someone take care of you for once." The words hit deeper than I wanted to admit. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of his hands pull me into a state of uneasy calm. But as the minutes stretched on, the air between us grew heavier. His movements slowed, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. "Joe," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. I turned my head slightly, catching his gaze. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between concern and something far more dangerous. Before I could process what was happening, his lips were on mine. The kiss was different this time. There was no hesitation, no testing the waters. It was deliberate, consuming, pulling me into a moment I couldn't escape even if I wanted to. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, but my body betrayed me. For a brief, electrifying moment, I let myself get lost in him. Then, reality snapped back. I jerked away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Nick, I can't," I stammered, my voice shaking. He stepped back immediately, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone laced with genuine regret. "That was— I shouldn't have—" I didn't let him finish. I bolted for the door, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out everything else. My cheeks burned as I passed Rayan in the hallway, but he didn't even glance up from his phone. In the car ride home, I sat in silence, my mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. Guilt clawed at me, sharp and unrelenting, but there was something else, too. Something I was too ashamed to name. As Rayan drove, oblivious to my turmoil, I stared out the window, wondering how much longer I could keep this from unraveling everything. The shift was subtle at first. A lingering glance here, a stray touch of hesitation there. It wasn't anything overt, but it was enough for Rayan to notice. He didn't say anything. He rarely did. But I could feel his eyes on me more often, studying me in that quiet, calculating way of his. The realization unsettled me, sending ripples of unease through my carefully constructed facade. At breakfast one morning, I caught him watching me as I absent-mindedly stirred my coffee. The newspaper lay untouched in front of him, his brow furrowed as if he were piecing together a particularly difficult equation. "Something on your mind?" I asked, forcing a lightness into my voice. He shook his head, his expression neutral. "Just thinking." I nodded, pretending to accept the answer, but the weight of his gaze lingered long after the conversation ended. The dinner at his parents' house later that week was no different. Rayan was quieter than usual, his responses clipped as if his mind were elsewhere. Meanwhile, Nick seemed his usual self, charming, irreverent, effortlessly magnetic. But there was an edge to his humor that hadn't been there before, a barely perceptible tension that I couldn't ignore. "Joan, could you pass the wine?" Nick asked from across the table, his voice casual. I reached for the bottle, my hand brushing his as he took it from me. The contact was brief, but I felt it, like a spark I couldn't quite extinguish. When I glanced up, Rayan was watching us, his expression unreadable. My stomach tightened. "Thanks," Nick said, flashing me a quick smile before turning his attention back to his plate. But the damage was done. I could feel the shift in the room, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Later that evening, as the others cleared the table, I excused myself to grab my phone from the living room. That's when it happened. Rayan, wandering into the same room under the pretense of finding his jacket, stumbled upon the photograph. It was propped on a small table near the bookshelf, part of a collection Nick had apparently printed for his portfolio. But this one stood out. A candid shot of me from the studio, my face framed by soft light, my expression thoughtful, almost vulnerable. It wasn't provocative, but it was undeniably intimate, capturing a side of me I hadn't even known existed. "Is this you?" Rayan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like the sharpness of a blade just before it strikes. I froze, my mind racing. "Oh, yeah," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Nick took it when we were working on some ideas for the house. I didn't realize he'd printed it." Rayan's eyes flicked back to the photo, then to me. "It's different, not like his usual stuff." "He's an artist," I replied, forcing a small laugh. "He likes to experiment." Rayan didn't respond. Instead, he set the photo back down with deliberate care, his expression unreadable. But I could see the gears turning in his mind, the tiny pieces of information falling into place. In the days that followed, his behavior changed. He became more attentive, not in the affectionate, doting way I'd been yearning for, but in a guarded, analytical way that made my skin prickle. He started asking more questions about my day, about Nick, about the time I spent away from home. His tone was always calm, his words carefully measured, but the underlying suspicion was impossible to ignore. "Nick seems to spend a lot of time around you," he remarked one evening, as we cleaned up after dinner. The statement was casual, almost offhand, but I could hear the weight behind it. "He's family," I replied, keeping my tone even. "It's not unusual." "Maybe," Rayan said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. "But it feels different lately, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. What could I say that wouldn't sound like a lie? By the end of the week, the tension was palpable. Rayan's silence spoke louder than any accusation ever could, and Nick's easy charm only added fuel to the fire. I found myself caught between two worlds, one defined by guilt and obligation, the other by a dangerous allure I couldn't seem to resist. And Rayan, he was watching, waiting. His quiet observations felt like the calm before a storm I knew I couldn't outrun. The house was eerily quiet that evening. the kind of stillness that settles right before something shatters. I could hear the faint hum of Rayan's voice coming from his office, the door slightly ajar. He was on the phone, speaking low, his words barely audible. Something about the tone struck me. Measured, deliberate, almost cold. I stepped closer, my curiosity betraying me once again. "I saw the pictures," he said, his voice tense but calm. "Don't try to cover for him, Mark." "I'm not an idiot." My stomach dropped. I pressed my hand against the wall for support, the edges of his words cutting through me like shards of glass. He knew. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the overwhelming sense of inevitability. I retreated to the living room, sinking into the couch, my mind a chaotic swirl of guilt and dread. When Rayan finally entered the room, his expression was unreadable, a mask of composure that only made the tension more unbearable. He stood across from me, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on mine. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" he asked, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with something far worse, disappointment. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My throat felt dry, my mind blank. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "Joan," he said again, his tone sharper this time. "Don't make me spell it out." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I whispered finally, my voice trembling. "But it did," he replied, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "Didn't it?" There was no point in lying, no way to salvage what had already been destroyed. I nodded slowly, tears welling up in my eyes. "It wasn't planned," I said, my voice cracking. "I swear, Rayan, it just happened." He laughed bitterly, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Things like this don't just happen, Joan. You made a choice." "You stopped seeing me," I shot back, surprising even myself with the force of my words. "You buried yourself in work, in everything but us. I was lonely, Rayan. I needed—" My voice broke, and I covered my face with my hands, unable to continue. "You needed what?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Passion? Excitement? Him?" I looked up, tears streaming down my face. "I needed to feel like I mattered," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Like I was more than just there. The weight of my confession hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Rayan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He took a step back, as if distancing himself from the reality of my words. "You mattered," he said finally, his voice shaking. "But you didn't even give me a chance to fix it, did you?" I wanted to argue, to tell him that I had tried, that I had been waiting for him to notice the cracks in our relationship, but the words felt hollow, like excuses for something I couldn't undo. Rayan turned away, his shoulders tense. "I can't do this right now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to think." "Rayan!" I started, but he cut me off with a raised hand. "No," he said firmly. "Not now." Without another word, he grabbed his jacket from the chair and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of our home. I sat there for hours, staring at the empty space where he had been, replaying every moment that had led to this. The guilt was unbearable, but beneath it was something even more terrifying: uncertainty. Would he come back? Could we fix this? Or had I destroyed the one thing that had always grounded me, chasing something I couldn't even define? The night stretched on, the shadows in the room growing longer as the weight of my choices settled over me. For the first time, I truly felt the enormity of what I had done, not just to Rayan, but to myself. The answers wouldn't come easily. Maybe they wouldn't come at all. But as I sat there, alone and lost, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.